Hey, how's it going? My name is James. Welcome to the video. Today I'm going to show you how I made this coat rack and shelf. Come check it out. So the first part of this project was getting the shelf made up, and this is actually just 3 2x4s that are glued together on their edges. And for this, the first step was just measuring them to the right length, marking the line across, and then taking them over to the miter saw to make the cuts. The next step I do in this process is to take them to the vise and start using a hand plane. Now, if you don't have a hand plane, you can do this in different ways. It's not strictly necessary, but this is nice so you can kind of see where the high spots are. You can take those down, and especially if you have a longer plane, you can make this nice and flat and smooth and even for the glue up. But the second thing that this does is it really takes off those rounded over corners or those rounded over edges on this dimensional lumber. And what that does is when you actually glue this together, now instead of having these dips in the wood where it comes together, it's just going to be flat all the way across. For the middle piece, you're going to want to plane both edges of the wood. And then for each side, you're going to choose one edge and you're going to plane that so that they all can come together quite nice. And this took a little while. You can see I kind of speeded up here to show you that it does take a little bit of time if you're going to do it this way, but at the end I think it does help quite a bit. Now once I finished planing those off, I took them to the vise, and this is where I kind of lined them up again, just trying to see what side looks the best. This wood did have some imperfections and some kind of deep gouges on the one side, so I wanted to make sure that those would go on the bottom and that all those kind of imperfections would be on the same side, so I just tried to make sure that would happen. In terms of gluing up, for this I just made sure that each of the side pieces had a bunch of glue on it, and then I stuck those together to the middle piece. Again, with the glue up, you're wanting to make sure that you have a plan going into it so that you can be efficient, so that you can get it done quickly. Just spreading that glue around on all the surfaces, making sure you have enough, but not so much that it's a big mess afterwards, but just so you get a little bit of squeeze out. And once I had that all tightened up and ready to go, I just took some plane shavings that I made earlier and cleaned those up. I took a look at the bottom and realized that there was probably a bit more glue than I needed, so I wiped that off the floor, wiped that off the bottom, and then just set that out to dry. Now at this point I worked on the actual other part, but I'm just going to continue to talk about the process of making the shelf just for the sake of continuity. So once this was dry, I took it out of the vise, took it towards the bench. Because my bench isn't long enough for this piece of wood, I had to kind of turn it around to work at it from both sides. And because of this, there was times where I was working against the grain and I got a little bit of tear out in the project. And so just something to think about in the future as I think about different projects. Most of the things I do are on a smaller scale, mostly boxes and kind of things like that. So this was kind of a longer piece and just something I had to deal with as I went through. Now, because this is smaller than the bench and it's not as wide, it was easier to work with. And it wasn't too long before, after doing some planing, you get a nice smooth surface and you kind of just work it all down so it's completely flat across. And with this, I wanted to make sure that it looked decent from the bottom and from the top, because if you go up the stairs to our house, you can look down upon it. So I just wanted to make sure I flipped it over and made sure all the sides were nice and smooth and even. After that was done, I brought it to the floor and started to apply a coat of stain. And it was about this far into the staining process that I ran out of memory on my memory card. And so you can just imagine the rest. It's not too exciting, but we got the stain on there and it was ready to go. And then the next day came in and did a coat of polyurethane, actually maybe 2 days later, once that was all settled and once that was all dried. So for the base assembly, I had a cedar plank that I had from, I think I picked this up at a garage sale as well, and it had very aggressively rounded over corners. And so the first thing I did was just to take those the edge off of one of those, because I wanted this shelf to sit flush on top. So I just made sure that this top edge here was nice and flat across, that the round over was gone. And then once that was done, I cut this to length, making sure it was the right length. And then I actually used a separate board that was the same material and cut out these little shapes here, these rounded over kind of support beams. And for these, it was kind of interesting. I set up a stop block on my miter saw to make sure that they were the exact right width so that they matched each other. And then from there, it was just a little bit of trying to decide exactly what shape to make these. I tried a bunch of different templates, so I tried different things to kind of trace onto this pattern, but I ended up using just a paint can lid, tracing that shape on, and removing the material. Now, my plan was originally to just use chisels to do this and to do some relief cuts, but just because of the aggressive nature of the angle and because cedar is a pretty brittle wood that can crack pretty easily, I just didn't feel like that was going to work very well. And so what I ended up using instead was just a coping saw cutting roughly towards that line and getting as close as I could without hitting that line. I find sometimes coping saws, you don't have as much control, or I should say, I don't have as much control with them as I would like. And so just getting close to that line and then actually taking a rounded rasp and just kind of using that to finish the cut all the way down to the line. And then actually I took a bottle of glue and sandpaper and just used that sandpaper to finish off that surface. And then actually with the second one, instead of using that paint can lid to trace it on, I just grabbed the one that I already completed, use that to trace the line on there, and then same thing, use a coping saw to get down to that line or at least close to it, taking the rasp after that, and then back to the glue bottle and the sandpaper and finishing off after that. Well, my plan was to kind of attach these without any hardware showing, and so the way that I did that was twofold. First thing I wanted to do was actually cut a groove into the wood where these things could sit. And so the process for this is I knew I wanted to be the same distance from the edge on each of these sides. And so I think I measured it was around 8 inches from the edge and just put a line across in that area. And then once I had that line defined, I used a chisel to kind of deepen that line so that I could actually put the piece I was going to use right into that line, and then take a knife and score a mark just kind of right underneath as you put it down. That way I know I'm working exactly to the dimensions I'm going to be using later on. And once I did that, it was just a matter of using my chisels to kind of define those lines further to make them deeper, using chisels to remove most of the waste, and then coming in with a router plane just at the very end to make sure we have a uniform depth right at the bottom. Now, if you don't have a router plane, you can use chisels to do this. It's just going to take a bit more care and a bit more finesse on your part. But the router plane works nicely because you know you have the exact depth that you want in each case. So once that was all finished, once I got that all cleared out, I did the same process with the next one. Once that was done, I took some glue and I glued these right into those grooves. And the nice thing was they fit pretty well. They didn't have to clamp them or anything. They just kind of held in place there with some glue, and I just left those overnight until the next day. Now, because this is not the deepest groove, and because kind of gluing end grain into something like this isn't the most secure wood joint, I decided to actually just put some other fasteners in from behind. Once these were in, I decided to paint everything white, and this time instead of my camera running out of space, it ran out of batteries. So once again, you can imagine just this amazing painting process that happened here as I basically just got some paint on this thing. At this point, the next day I came back, it was dry, and I was ready to attach it to the wall. And for this, basically I knew that there was some studs in here I wanted to really kind of anchor into, and it worked out pretty well for me to actually center it on a main stud. Once I found that, I could kind of work my way out, and it just centered really nicely. But whatever your situation is, you'd want to obviously check that out and figure out the best solution for you. But for me, it worked nicely to kind of find that centerpiece, get that attached, and then from there I can use the level to make sure it was level. I could kind of work my way out, attaching into further studs so that this thing's just on there really nice and securely, and that's kind of what we did. In terms of these coat hangers, these are coat hangers I just bought at the local hardware store, and so it was kind of up to me to decide how far to space them apart. So again, what I did is I actually just grabbed the middle one, and just because I knew exactly where the middle point was, I attached it right in the middle. And then from here, it was a little bit of math and a flashback to story problems of trying to make these completely centered within each side. And so I had 5, so I knew 1 in the middle, 2 on this side, 2 on that side, and I tried my best to make them as centered as possible and as symmetrical as possible, and I think that was achieved fairly nicely. At this point, once all the screws were in and it was nice and secured to the wall, once all the coat hangers were nice and secured, it was feeling pretty good. And at this point, I was just about ready to assemble it completely by putting the shelf on top. And so what I did is I kind of put that on there in place, and then I actually screwed down into different parts, into here, into the back here, just to make sure that this thing wouldn't go anywhere. And I think it's gonna be pretty stable. My one fear is that eventually my kids will start kind of using this as monkey bars, and then we might have to reinforce it in some ways. But for just normal everyday use, I think it's going to do just fine. After that, it was just a matter of hanging some coats to test it out. We had these baskets kicking around, and they kind of complete the look a little bit. It's going to be, again, just a way for us when we come in from outside to hang up our coats, store our boots, some mittens and gloves, things like that. I think it's going to be a pretty good addition to the house. If you want, you can check out the video I made last week talking about how I made this bench, and you can kind of see how this whole process came together. Well, this is kind of it for the garage project of making this bench and this coat rack and everything else. I think my next project is probably going to be a side table for an armchair we have in the house. So if you want, come check that out. I'm going to hopefully start working on that in the next couple weeks here. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more of them, hit subscribe. And until next time, take care.